Dorsey here. I'm currently with the scholar, Master Printmaker Curlee Raven Holton. Curlee, we've had a relationship for a number of years, man. I've always, appreciated your candor, knowledge, how willing you are to work with us younger artists and dealers and people in the field. So I just want to say thank you to start. And I'm really excited.
I'm a firm believer that generosity breeds generosity, generosity breeds generosity.
Okay. We're bringing you in for the Atlanta Fine Art Print Fair, and one as a printmaker, but also as a scholar. Can you talk to us briefly about the history of printmaking and African American printmakers of the past?
Yeah, printmaking as a specific medium has been important to African American artists. Now, of course, not the same span of time that it has been for American or European artists, because they had limited access to resources, limited access to print studios. That still happens to this day. So having access to materials, an opportunity to make a print, to have the knowledge and information needed to use the language and the medium of printmaking, because it has its own technology, it has its own chemicals, it has its own tools. And normally when we go to school to study art, we generally focus on becoming painters traditionally, or sometimes sculptors, if that's the direction that you feel inclined to go. But printmaking was a very kind of special direction. And again, African American and European artists have been very much involved in the printmaking medium. It wasn't unusual for them to participate in it. But for African American, it was very rare. And their first introduction primarily came in Europe, especially with someone like Henry O. Tanner, who did a number of important early etchings. The Rising of Lazarus, that was based on his very famous painting that won the gold medal at the Paris Salon, that really brought him international attention. He did a small etching of that particular piece, I think it was 1918. And then he did a smaller piece on the north coast of Europe. And he also did a number of small etchings, the gates of Tangiers, when he was traveling as well. So sometimes you'll see those in auction. But normally they don't think about Henry O. Tanner as a printmaker, but as a visual artist who used printmaking to complement their practice. And that was the introduction that he got by studying in Europe, and also at the Pennsylvania Academy, perhaps, for a little bit of introduction and information. But primarily for Tanner, when he got a chance to go to Europe, that's when he met other artists that were using. Mary Cassatt was using printmaking. She was a very prominent artist from a wealthy family traveling through Europe. Her father was a banker and supported her travels through Europe and selection of artists that she became friends with. And Tanner was one that she met as well and introduced his work to other artists. So you had artists like Tanner being introduced to printmaking. Again, it was a European tradition and practice. For Tanner, his art gods was Cezanne, Caravaggio, Rembrandt, people like this, that he was inspired by. So he, of course, followed that tradition, not only in terms of technique and subject matter, but also mediums, paintings, as well as small etchings that were metal plates that were then drawn upon, either engraved in or dropped in a bath of acid that the line is etched into. So you're doing it on the surface or you're digging into the surface to produce the print image. And you're doing it for two primary reasons. You're doing it because there was a collector's audience in Europe for fine prints through the bookstores. So when you want to see a fine print, you actually went to bookstores and they had fine prints, and they had large display cases like giant maps that would fold out. And that's where you saw prints. Actually, there's a story of David Driscoll on the left bank of Paris, went into a small bookstore, antique store, and bought him a Rembrandt etching for, I think he told me, $10. And he found out later that Rembrandt etching that he had, that impression was better than one in the major museum in Paris. That was a $10 Rembrandt that he got with his signature on it. So, that print was a way in which the European artists communicated to their audience. Now, for African American artists, as I mentioned, Henry Tanner did investigate that medium because he was in Europe. But really, it didn't become popular until the WPA program in the 1930s, when you had workshops that were established, and African American artists were invited into those workshops. The Harlem workshop in New York City, where Jacob Lawrence studied and others studied. Bob Blackburn studied there with Augustus Savage, who helped set that workshop up and was a really famous teacher, and also a sculptress. But she was a famous teacher and inspired Bob, as I mentioned, Bob Blackburn and Jacob Lawrence and others to investigate the printmaking medium. Well, for Bob, Blackburn took it to heart and began to participate in the WPA program that had Doc Thrash in Philadelphia and other artists that were involved in this. So they had access that was provided by the government. The word's Project Administration, that's what the WPA stands for. So it only lasted for a few years where it was really vital, but it did continue some years after, but not with the same kind of vitality. Now, for African American artists, they still face many barriers. For example, even though they were in the WPA program, they were segregated into what they called the Artists Guild. So you had the mainstream white artists that were participating in the WPA program, but Black artists, African American artists, were placed in what they call Artists Guild. So they all were segregated all over again. Well, Bob Blackburn was doing lithography, some etching, some relief printing, and he was so inspired and taken by this, he established one of the first printmaking workshops in the US in the 1950s in New York City. That became the famous Bob Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. But there are others that practice also. We want to make sure we recognize who they are. Not only did Tanner do some of the prints, Hal Woodruff did some when he was traveling through Europe. You had a number of major artists who would go to Europe, African-American artists who would go to Europe to meet Henry Tanner. Because Henry Tanner was so popular, he even had what they call Tanner schools in the US, little gatherings of disciples of Tanner, where you could go and study Tanner's techniques. So Hal Woodruff went to Paris to meet Tanner, to pay homage to the art god, one of the art gods. And there's a recorded conversation between him and Tanner, where Tanner asked Hal Woodruff, who was his art god? And he said Cézanne was. And Tanner said, that's a good art god to have. And you can see in Hal Woodruff's work the influence of Cézanne, the three-dimensionality in a landscape, creating solid shapes that were abstract and cubistic. That was influence from Cézanne that, of course, Hal Woodruff took and transformed that into his own kind of technique. Another one, William H. Johnson, was very much influenced by Cézanne and other European artists. The rolling organic landscapes, you know, they were like breathing bodies of surfaces. But later he turned and did some interesting silk screens, very limited color silk screens, some monoprints of his farm series and his workers series. I think that was the 1940s and probably up to the 1950s. Those are very highly collected works on paper, collage, as well as hand-done works, as well as some serigraphs. And those works demonstrated his unique shift in style. He became very simplistic. Now, this is a message that they were getting, especially as African-American artists, that it was important for them to speak about their reality and their world. And I know you do that through Black Art in America, is to make sure that narrative and that story is celebrated in the African-American experience. It has a long history, because you have someone like Jacob Lawrence who spoke about that. You, of course, know Roman Bearden spoke about the need to do that. But William H. Johnson said it was his motives as an artist and his goal to capture the spirit of the Negro. So this idea that he wanted to capture that voice and that reality. And he began by painting portraits of his cousins and his nieces and nephews, you know. So his early paintings show those are family members from the South when he would return to the South from New York City. So there's a long tradition of the printmaking beginning to follow the trajectory of African-American art, contemporary African-American art. And then, of course, along comes Bob Blackburn, who is in New York City, and he's around all these major artists, like, as I mentioned, Roman Bearden and others. And then you have Ron Adams, who in the 1980s, one of the first, late 1970s, first African-American artists to be certified as a master printer by Gemini Prints in Los Angeles. He was invited to do the first big major print as a signature piece for David Driscoll's 2 Centuries of Black American Art. That's 1750 to 1950. Well, that lithograph that you see in there was recommended by Charles White, of Charles White's own work. And he had a very close connection with Ron Adams. They actually established a handmade art and limited edition art studio. Him and a number of other artists got together and established that workshop. So Ron left Gemini and did his own thing until he retired. And then I think he retired finally in Atlanta, because I did meet him in Atlanta a few years ago while visiting. So again, it was Bob Blackburn, Ron Adams, and a very famous lithograph that he did of Bob Blackburn with the collector at the background. Very famous lithograph, but that was Ron Adams' work. So again, Ron Adams was one of the first classically trained and certified. Of course, Bob Blackburn was the first to establish a major workshop and what we call the father of African-American printmaking. Because not only did he make the work himself, he created the environment for the work to be made. And we're talking about 2 artists that have worked with the major artists of their time. Robert Rauschenberg, Motherwell, Jasper Johns, all of the major artists have worked with Bob Blackburn and Ron Adams. There's this great story about Bob Blackburn working with Robert Rauschenberg, and he was working on a very famous stone. This is for Tanya Grossman at Universal Limited Prints in Long Island. And Bob was working on a giant stone, and the stone split. And he was devastated because the stone had split. And they brought in a printmaker from Yale, a lithographer, specialist, comes in from Yale. He looks at the stone, and he says the stone was imperfect. It had an imperfect vein going through it, which caused it to split. Now, Bob is devastated. Bob leaves Long Island, leaves New York, goes to Paris, and rides along the French countryside on a motorcycle, man. And he does beautiful watercolors while he's there. And I've seen some of those watercolors. So Bob was devastated by it and didn't want to talk about it. He thought it was his fault that he had cracked this piece by Robert Rauschenberg. Well, they rejoined it, and Rauschenberg loved the crack in the piece. So they did the edition, and it was called The Accident. That piece is hanging in the foyer of the MoMA. It was the first American print to win international recognition and win the Taipei Prize for printmaking. That was The Accident that Bob Blackburn was a part of. So here we have the intersection of the history of the African-American artist, printmaker, with mainstream art and mainstream printmaking. However, in spite of that, there's always been this separation or this dichotomy, this split, where it's African-American art or mainstream art. For a number of reasons. The politics of America, race-based segregation, race-based education, housing segregation, all these issues kept these communities separate. And as a result of that separation, we can talk about how negative that was, but as a result of it, African Americans developed a sort of unique ethnic-based voice, subject matter, ways in which they played with the material, the experimentation, the improvisation, the subject matter. And there's 2 reasons I think that was relevant for African-American artists. One, there was no market. So they didn't have to worry about disappointing anybody or meeting anybody's expectation. The Harlem Renaissance had passed. During the Harlem Renaissance, though, there was an expectation. There was an expectation by the white patrons of Harlem, which include Mary Brady of the Harmon Foundation and others. Judith Rosenwald, who created the Rosenwald Foundation that provided scholarships to a lot of artists like Faith Ringo, John Biggers, and others, and as well as Elizabeth Catlett, whole range, John Wilson. These were Rosenwald fellows that were allowed to travel around the world and investigate new mediums and new practices, and the Rosenwald Foundation supported that effort. They also gave out literary grants to writers of the time as well. I think Langston Hughes probably got 1 or 2 during that time as well. Jean Tomei received one. Now, Jean Tomei, I don't know if you know Jean Tomei's work. He was a very well-known poet during the Harlem Renaissance, but he was also George O'Keeffe's lover. So when you see the movie about George O'Keeffe and you see this black man dancing with George O'Keeffe on the dance floor, that's Jean Tomei. So there's a lot of stories, man, I could tell you. But anyway, but that's the other side of it. So it's about relationships. So what I'm trying to get to is that although there was opportunity, African-American artists did face severe segregation and discrimination in our world. And as you know yourself, only recently have institutions paid attention to them. And primarily the reason they pay attention to them is because there is a market. There's a desire to consume the work. Two reasons that market is relevant, I believe. One is the change of thinking of white collectors perceiving the work as being valuable. Museums and institutions who now are convinced the work is valuable because of that audience. Secondly, because there is a black elite that is successful enough financially to acquire those major works, so they have become major collectors. So as a result, the institutions are attempting to catch up with this movement. But for the most part, it remains race-based, because if you look overall, the most celebrated artists of this period of time are artists that are portraying people of color in extreme palettes, whether it's Kerry James Marshall, whether it's, you could just go down the list of these African-American artists that are portraying figurative work of African-American artists for consumption in the marketplace, not consumption of their own community, but consumption of the white dominant community, dominant collectors. They're still doing the Harlem Renaissance, from my perspective. For example, it was a saying that during the Harlem Renaissance, you would come to Mary Brady's cocktail parties, an African-American artist, you knock on the back door by the kitchen, you show her the painting or the sculpture. If it was Negro enough, she invited you in to the party. And then she would make you a star. And she did that for a number of artists. William H. Johnson, Palmer Hayden was a janitor. She helped support David Driscoll in many ways throughout his career early on. So you had to fit that kind of aesthetic stereotype to get the attention of the audience. And to me, that is still pervasive. It still operates, unfortunately. So these artists were doing printmaking, again, to demonstrate that they were able to participate in the larger aesthetic practice, painting, printmaking, sculpture, things like this, but also because those prints were accessible and affordable to the community. You could buy that print. Elizabeth Catlett did this. Elizabeth Catlett would print a print, and sometimes when it ran out, the edition was exhausted, she'd print it all over again, which was not something you ought to do, but she was doing it because she was very much about the community, about having an audience, about providing the images. So she was anti-capitalistic in this sense, you know? So there's a lot of work out there. So Elizabeth Catlett is a perfect example of a phenomenal printmaker that goes all the way back to the 1930s in her practice. And also was at the same time practicing along with Charles White, who was her husband at that time when they went to Mexico and studied in Mexico with Diego Rivera. They knew Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo personally. I talked to Elizabeth Catlett about this on occasion when I was down in Cuernavaca doing work with her. So from my perspective and experience, I was trying to participate with this great history, this great canon. And I wanted to get into that chain somehow. And that was primarily through my introduction to Elizabeth Catlett, who introduced me to Bob Blackburn and others. And I began to work with all these other artists as their master printmaker. But what was amazing to me is even William T. Williams and Mel Edwards, and, except for Sam Gilliam, these artists were really not invited to main workshops. They weren't invited to Gemini or ULE. They weren't invited to Tandem Press. Sam was, because of the long relationship. Not only a long relationship, Tandem Press that was established in out in Wisconsin by Bill Wiggy. He just started his workshop in a little barn called Jones Road. And his first artist of this famous tandem workshop now was his friend Sam Gilliam. So Sam Gilliam would go out to the farm, would take a single shotgun loaded up with pellets full of paint and shoot the canvases and paint would come out the front of the gun and land on the canvases. So Sam was doing all kinds of strange things, you know, but they were experimenting. There were no limitations. And Tandem Press was a great collaborator with Sam throughout his entire career. So that printmaking became mainstream for a couple artists, Sam Gilliam, Per Ewer, and a few other artists who had access to the marketplace. But for the most part, it had been Romeo Bearden that was really advancing printmaking as a popular form, not in the 1970s, with his series that he was doing. His jazz work, Jamming at the Savoy, and images like this was a contemporary way of using the printmaking medium. And he started that with Bob Blackburn in New York City and went on to print with other printmakers, and later had his own private printmaker that he did a lot of work in the Caribbean, and he had his printmaker down there printing with him. So with Romeo Bearden, because now they had a market, you had consumption going on. He was very popular, and of course, he was the first African American to get a major exhibition at the Metropolitan, and that was due to the protests of a lot of Black artists, including Benny Andrews and Faith Ringo. So he got that one person showing and made him famous. And he was chosen for this. And of course, the work was beautiful work. He did a lot of experimental work with spiral. His projection pieces, no one has seen these photo projection pieces like this before. He was experimenting with those, so he's finding a language, and he found a unique language to articulate this abstract kind of concept of African-American life. These figures were flat. They had an African sort of profile. He incorporated African art in those images. African motifs, which were, of course, influence that he had as a young artist studying in New York City. Hal Woodruff was the one who made that very popular, to bring in African-American art into that conversation. David Driscoll continued with that. A lot of artists did this. Jennings did it in New York. Small statues of African sculptures in his early prints. So it was a very important sort of compositional element, a way in which they acknowledged a heritage that was not Eurocentric, that was Afrocentric. And that is all that still retains itself today as an important motif for African-American artists. So these artists did that, and that brought the language closer to home. And Bearden, again, as I mentioned, was the most recognized contemporary African-American artist. You know, at the disappointment of many others who had worked very hard prior to him. Lois Mailou Jones didn't get the attention that he got. A lot of artists didn't get the attention that Bearden got, because Bearden was very palatable for that audience. Not only that, two things were operating with both Bearden and Jacob Lawrence. There was no question that they were African-American artists because of the subject matter. There was no ambiguity. You can look at a Sam Gilliam or a number of other artists, Ed Clark and others, and you couldn't tell whether they're African-American artists. Well, there is an audience for that kind of abstraction. But the big audience wanted to have a work of art by an African-American that spoke about the African-American experience. Mm-hmm. And we see this with R.B. Smith's work, and we saw it with Colescott's work, you know, Before the Mayflower, and George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware. You know, Robert Colescott's work was very much in their face, you know. And of course, other printmakers or artists that use the printmaking, that was very important. I'm trying to think of her name right now. Just anyway, it became a very important part of their body of work, because again, it was accessible, and it also gave them an additional language. But the master printer's role was to help facilitate that, to help provide the language and also the technology to help them advance that medium. Cheryl Walker is another example of using the printmaking in her work. Not as a printmaker herself, but the works were produced by master printers for the marketplace. So it has expanded the opportunities for African-American artists, not only a unique language, a new aesthetic kind of investigation, but an economic return as well.
Yeah. Speaking of economic return, I was talking with one of my really good patrons, Miss E, and she often talked about how when she was in school. And Ms. E, you know, she would be your contemporary, so she was in school a number of decades ago, and she ended up taking student loan money to buy one of Elizabeth Catlett's portfolios. That you know, back in the day, and you know, the thing is, like, one of those portfolios recently sold at auction. I'm gonna say, you know, 3 or 4 years ago for like 99,000, and she had the was fortunate to place it with a major institution north of that number within the last year. So, but when most people think about a lot of the collectors we talk to, you know, they're not really uh, you know, savvy enough to really understand and appreciate the fact that, you know, fine art printmaking appreciates in value, just like, you know,
Oh,
paintings and sculptures. Yeah, can you speak a little bit to that for those collectors that
yeah,
want to make sure? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
yeah. We witnessed that, and the print artist, you know, works by African American artists, printmaking has in many ways followed the mainstream. So, you know, you see an early print by Rauschenberg that was sold for $1,500 is sold for $15,000 or $50,000. You see that with a Joseph Stella. You see that with all these major artists. So we began to see African American artists getting access to that marketplace also, and that their work has grown in value. The problem is the value is assigned, can be assigned to the work of art for historical purposes, its rareness, its scale, its symbolism, that work of art doesn't really represent the mission and the vision of that artist, the integrity of that vision. Does it profoundly represent that? So it could be a unique piece of artwork that is then acquired. And then what happens is that you have this intersection of critics now, African-American critics and reviewers, that are able to really talk about the work. You know, even in your own memory, there was a time when there were no African-American art scholars out there able to talk about the work of art and why the work was important. You know, we're still just one generation away from having the first African-American PhD in art history. So Mel Lewis, so you're talking about a short span of having expertise around the work. Well, we got expertise around the work now. So you got critics around the artwork. You have art historians that are talking about how valuable that work is. You have museums that now want to have that work represented in their collections. So this is all raising the value of the work. So it was a matter of time for these things to intersect with the work itself. So what has happened is that you have some collectors who bought prints because they were very affordable, as you mentioned, off a student loan. And then they find out years later that the market has a demand for the pieces because the pieces aren't being made anymore because those artists are, in many cases, are deceased. So they become rare. But that conversation didn't exist before. That conversation is now really kind of intense. And also, I know you've discovered this as well. You have people that have collected work over the last 30 years because they loved it, not paying much attention to the value of it and the cost of it because it was very affordable. And now they realize that Bearden that they bought in 1980 for $500 is worth $50,000 now. Yep. So this is new for them. This is not new for the American mainstream market because it has always grown in value because you always had a gallery system assigning value to it. It would be sold and then it would go up to the next gallery. It would be collected and resold again. We didn't have that system in place. That system is still not fully evolved. Now we have these sporadic kind of commercial opportunities. You have a black auction occurring of African-American art. You have a few galleries that are vital, that are in African-American art. What I mean by vital, they can exist and they continue to exist because they've established a good reputation. They sell quality work, the work that you've done in Black Art in America. These are institutions that didn't exist before. Now, those institutions that did exist were all socially based institutions, whether it was the workshop in Harlem, whether it was the community outreach centers, the Chicago Community Center, where Elzea Couture worked at, and others. These were all community centers just to give opportunity for young Black people to come in and make art. Nobody was thinking about value of that work. Nobody. Every now and then you've had collectors come in and discover that work was valuable. I had a collector from Chicago last year buy a Faith Ringo from me. And he called me, he says, I understand you have some Faith Ringos, and we talked about it. He says, you know, I want to tell you something. I have been buying African-American art, he said, for the last 10 years or so, just because I wanted to. It is the only thing that keeps my gallery open now. And he's an Aaron Gallery in Chicago. It's been in operation probably 20, 30 years. He said, this is what keeps my gallery open now, is the work by African-American artists. So something has happened. You see, something has happened.
Yeah, yeah. What would you say to artists that I don't, do you think the same number of artists, you know, from a percentage standpoint, are engaged in printmaking as part of their practice today as there were, you know, 10 to 20, say 20, 30 years ago?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. We had a generation of artists that were mastering it as a medium or as a discipline, as a way to speak, to find their own voice. Because printmaking is considered a form of essay, if you want to consider it to literature. It's a form like essay. It can be biting, direct, and quickly produced. So it has a special purpose. And there's a group of collectors that appreciate the print medium. Now, for young African-American artists, they don't normally meet those collectors or that audience. And they don't make the kind of money they want. So they make a print, they want to sell a painting for $50,000 in a gallery or $20,000 in a gallery. Nothing wrong with that. And they don't want to spend the time mastering the technique and the medium or knowing much about it. When Chicago Booker made her first print with me, that was the first time she had made a print, had not made a print. So you had sculptures, and you had to, sculptures selling for $100,000. Then you got to pay $50,000 to move it and install it.
Right.
Yeah. But now with prints, her community can actually acquire her work and own her work. So it gives you access. So not every artist is aware of that. So no, the generation of those that are in the classically trained schools going to study the work traditionally is really limited. I have met probably in the last 10 years, 3 African-American graduate students that are focused in printmaking. And I'm one of few that do operate a workshop, a print studio. I don't know anybody else that operates one personally that operates a print studio. And I know others that are involved in making prints, Stephen Prince and others, yes, but operating a print studio for the public. Yeah. I don't know of any that's doing it. Now, you can find a nonprofit workshop like Brandywine or a printmaking workshop in New York City. But what about a commercial workshop that is devoted to making prints with artists for the marketplace to enhance that career of that artist, to enhance their ability to generate income, to a traditional workshop, not a nonprofit, not a social project. I'm not talking about a social project.
I got you.
They don't exist. Now, why is that the case? I think because everybody wants to be a painter. That was what they said when I was in school, and it's still pretty popular right now. Everybody wants to be a painter. Because when you look at, then, dealers they don't make the kind of money off of a print they make off of a painting. You know what I mean? I remember we were working with Radcliffe Bailey, and this dealer didn't want him to make a print because he thought the print would compete against his paintings, his collage works. Don't make a print, Radcliffe. Don't do it. Don't do it. So that's about the audience, not about the medium. It's about the audience driving it. So it's unfortunate.
Yeah. It really is unfortunate because I see it as a way to keep collectors and people who are interested in art engaged, or even
for people
who are looking to get into the market, that's their point of entry, could be a fine art print. You know what I mean? And so I don't see it as something that takes away, because I mean, how many significant paintings can the average collector buy where they can continue to, acquire?
Precisely.
Right. So that's, it's unfortunate that many people see it that way.
No, it's about knowledge. I think you're right about that. I used to do a lot of artist books for a while. I was really taken by it. And that was printmaking, but bound and limited editions. But I had a number of collectors. So I found out that there are groups out there that are bibliophiles. These are people that are collecting fine art books, man. So I have a surgeon who collected my books. I would go to his home in Atlantic City, and he had bookcases built in his living room. So you go in and you see the books displayed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So these are, it is a lack of a broad understanding of the practice, a broad understanding of arts. There's a very narrow kind of limited understanding. And I know you've been trying to broaden that. We can call it education, but I don't think it's just education. I think it's broadening the aesthetic appreciation, the aesthetic comprehension, the aesthetic understanding that what is beautiful and how to broaden that notion of beauty, how it captures other things and how those things have value, assigning value. I mean, we're both in the business of assigning value to something.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important project, and to bring people into that conversation, into that understanding of the value and how that value is so critical to us because it is our cultural legacy. It's a visual legacy, but a cultural legacy, a historical legacy. And they get to participate in it. They get to not only participate in it, by collecting the work, they not only have possession of that object, they have helped economize, in a sense, they help finance the project of making art. So they buy a piece from you. They allow you to continue to operate. You are able to invest in artists. You're able to create a foundation, which gives support to artists. So you see, they feed it by buying that piece of artwork. They feed the larger picture. So they are part of the building of this as like they get to be cultural warriors. They get to participate in the cultural war, man.
Yeah, and so lastly, I wanna ask you this, considering this is our second year for the Atlanta Fine Art Print Fair. Last year was extremely successful. I mean, my God, the number of people that came through, the energy, the works that were sold. I mean, it was extremely successful. We anticipate the same success, and if not more, this year. What does it mean from you, Scholar, to see this take place? This Atlanta Fine Art Print Fair, from what I understand, is the only print fair focused on African American printmakers that's going on right now.
Yeah, let me start by complimenting you, because there's been conversations about something like this happening, not only in Atlanta, but something like this happening. But you're the one that made it happen. You did it. And that's something about your entrepreneurial spirit. You're a swingale, they call them. They're swingales. You take something and you imagine it, and then you manifest it in the real world. Now, that's what art is about. That's what making art is about. Making art is about making a dream a reality. Because we're always in a certain kind of dream state, and we have to sort out what is real and what is unreal. So you wake up in the morning and you say, I'm going to go into the world and I'm going to make this happen. That's a dream. Mm-hmm. The reality is what is left at the end of the day. Did it happen? So we're an artist. What we do is we take materials, raw materials, and it could be people, it could be money, it can be materials, it can be an opportunity, it can be a vacant space. Look at what you transformed. You took that space on that corner that was vacant and desolate, and look at what you did. You turned it into a garden. And I don't mean a garden because you have a garden outside, but you grow something, you make something happen. And that's a gift to the community, and the community gives back. So you gave them a way to nurture themselves. You gave them a way to feed themselves. That is not only being an entrepreneur, that is being a creative person, and your medium is not just collage, paint, and photograph. Your medium is also people. Your medium is also space. Your medium is also the possibilities that exist. So I think that's what this is really about. So this art fair is about a possibility of bringing people together around printmaking and celebrating that history and that legacy, that it also belongs to them, that it's not just out there in the world that they don't have access to, but it belongs to them. We're a long way from colored day at the museums. There used to be in the South, there used to be a colored day. where you could only go once a week to the museum. We're a long way from color day. You know, there's a whole different game going on. And now you become the facilitator, the active agency of it. You know, and this is phenomenal. This is great. So it's not just a print. That, you know, the print fair is really the medium of your expression. You organize it, but that's not what it is. It's something larger than that. You gather people together. They exchange resources in exchange for their work of art. You see them engage in artists. Artist is validated. I know you watch this. Someone buys a major piece by an artist, whether it's an institution or an individual, and an artist is reinforced. Feel the dream can be real. They can afford to dream in the real world while they're awake, you know, dreaming while you're awake. And that they have value, that what's inside them internally has value. Well, this has been this long battle for us. You know, we're talking about a 300-year battle in this continent about suggesting that what we have inside ourselves is valuable. There's a line from Nikki Finney, the poet. She says, she talks about, I did a book with her, and it's about called The Black Boy, and she describes a young black slave as not having pockets on his pants, no pockets. And the reason he had no pockets, because he had no possessions to put in the pocket. Why would he need pockets? He has no possessions. I've never forgotten that when she said that. So we've come a long way from having trousers with no pockets, man, you know? And so the art fair, the print fair, is about putting things in those pockets.
Making those connections. Curlee, thank you. You give us life, man. You give us energy. I'm honored to know you. I think the world of you, man. And I look forward to you coming and being at the 2nd annual Atlanta Fine Art Print Fair next month.
And as you know, I don't travel for anybody much. You know, this is a rare one that I'm gonna, but it's important. I think it's really important. So I appreciate the invitation, and I'm traveling by vehicle with my family, so I can take it easy and get there and spend time with you. All right.
Thank you, Scott. Have a great day.
All right. Take care. Okay.